to just talk about something kind of about the Catholic Church, and that I think that I have found to be a real gift in my life. And I was really kind of struggling with what to talk about. And what do you share with somebody about your faith, to try and sum it up in kind of one thing in a few minutes. And so one of the things that, based on some circumstances in my life, my brother got diagnosed with cancer, and he's only 19 years old. And so as I was driving back and forth to the hospital yesterday a couple different times, it hit me. I was like, let's talk about suffering. And that seems like a really, hey, what's a good selling point for your Catholic faith? Suffering it's a great reason to join. I wanted to just share a little bit about how I think one of the greatest gifts for me in my Catholic faith is kind of our understanding and our approach and our theology of suffering, and how it's been a lot of has given me a lot of comfort and a lot of help. I think there's a lot of confusion out there about suffering, and kind of, if we're looking at what things kind of distinguish Catholicism, a lot of faiths believe in Jesus. A lot of faiths believe in God. A lot of faiths believe that they celebrate Easter, and a lot of faiths celebrate Christmas. And so what then, if we're thinking about what makes Catholicism different, I think one of those things is the Church's teaching on suffering. And when you look around the world and kind of what other people say about suffering, you find very different things besides what the Church teaches. You have some people who will talk about, even Christians, will talk about how suffering is punishment for whatever. It's just God being mad. And they'll point to the Old Testament, and they'll talk about where in the Old Testament it talks about things like, God got angry at these people and sent them all smallpox, or something like that. And so people will look at that and they'll say, well, that's how God is. God, and that's their worldview, that God punishes people with suffering, and that if you're experiencing suffering, you get punished. You even see that on some of those the big mega churches. You turn on the TV Sunday morning, and somebody with really white teeth is preaching and they're talking about, if you commit to God, God's going to bless you and He's going to love you and you're going to get all kinds of money. And if you don't, though, then you're going to get cancer. And that's their worldview. Like, God blesses you if you love God and you do the right things and you pray hard enough, then you're going to get blessed. And if you don't, then you're going to get punished. So come over here and be like us. And so we have all these different views. Some people see the body and suffering as like all of this world, and like our bodies is just it's something that we just need to overcome and like transcend. Sign of the Eastern Buddhist spiritualism, kind of like my body's just a prison for my soul, and my soul needs to leave, so whatever happens to my body, it doesn't really matter. All these kinds of things. And that's not really at all what the Church says about suffering. And the Church has a very unique message about suffering. And I want to tell you, the first time when I recognized this, I was a chaplain for a hospital one summer. And it's part of becoming a priest. We had this assignment. And so it was a Methodist hospital in Indianapolis, one of our big, huge mega hospitals in downtown Indianapolis. And so we got to work alongside a lot of different chaplains of all these different faiths. And we got to go into a lot of rooms of people. Obviously, the vast majority of the rooms where I went in as a chaplain, they weren't Catholic. And so what I noticed, and I wasn't looking for this at all. I wasn't like I went in with this Catholic bias, trying to prove that we were better or something like that. But I noticed in room after room, day after day, there was a huge difference when I went into the room of a Catholic or a Catholic family, and versus basically most of the other rooms that I went into, especially when there was some real trauma going on. Almost without fail, when I went into the room and it was a Catholic family, there was a calm and a peace there. There wasn't this wailing and yelling and screaming. There was this sort of, even if it was a huge trauma, a hugely, car wreck that night, and ER, and the daughter might not make it, all these kind of things. There was a calm there that I didn't experience when I went into almost every other room. And I just thought that to me was I'm kind of like a science, I was a math major, and I kept noticing this pattern, you notice patterns as a math guy. And that was a pattern that I picked up on. there was a marked difference. Again, that I wasn't even looking for or trying to notice, but I figured that out after over the course of that summer. And so I think that the question probably comes up, like, what does the church say about suffering? What makes it different? What makes the church's message about suffering different than a lot of the other things that you hear about suffering and a lot of the other theologies that you hear about suffering? And I think that first of all, the church talks about how suffering is a mystery. And a lot of times we hear mystery and that's a cop-out, right? Like, oh, it's a mystery. That's why George Carlin, the great comedian, I think he went to Catholic school at some point, but he seemed like a pretty angry Catholic at this point from what I had seen on some of his older stuff. But anyways, he talked about Catholic Church always says something's a mystery if they can't explain it. So you just cop out, it's a mystery. But what we mean by saying that suffering is a mystery is not that we can't say anything about it. It's just that we don't completely understand it. We can't get our arms around it. And so in the midst of suffering, there is in the Catholic camp an understanding that I can't grasp this. And there's an okayness about that. Like, I don't sit around thinking like, boy, if I think harder about this, I can get to the bottom of why this is going on. So I don't spend any time doing that. I don't spend any time trying to sit there and think about, well, let's see, was this because I didn't fast hard enough on Ash Wednesday, or was this a punishment for what I did back when I was a freshman in high school, or all those kind of things, all those kind of crazy things, or, I don't have to understand suffering, and I don't try, and I don't spend all that mental energy and anguish trying to get to the bottom of the source of the suffering. And so the second thing that the church says about suffering is that suffering gets us to ask a question, though, which is, why are we suffering? Why do we experience suffering? And what John Paul II said, actually in a letter that he wrote when he was obviously still the Pope, he wrote a letter and he said that what happens when we suffer is that Christ answers our suffering from the cross. He answers our suffering from the cross. And I think that's a hugely important thing. We're the only church really that has crucifixes around. And that's not because we're obsessed with death. It's because what we see the cross as being hugely important in explaining suffering and helping us while we're experiencing suffering. We look to the cross, and what we see is we don't get an answer, but what God says to us in the cross is, I suffered too. I suffered this huge cross, this huge suffering, and again, you're not going to get the answer necessarily from me like you were hoping, but all I can tell you, Christ is saying, is that I join you in your suffering. I suffered too, and I know what you're experiencing, and I'm with you in that suffering. And I think that's very different. It's one thing I saw a lot of times too in those hospital rooms alongside people who were other chaplains from other faiths sometimes going in, and it was like, trying to tell them, don't worry about it, and Jesus rose from the dead, and some of these interesting things. It was like they were trying to make them feel better, whereas the church is kind of like, well, we're not going to explain it, we're not going to understand it, we're not going to try and make you feel better, but again, Christ suffered, and that has a huge impact on how we view suffering then as well, because Christ went through it. And so another thing that the church says that's very different, and I think this leads to a lot of the calmness for Catholics and a lot of the strength for Catholics in the midst of suffering, is that we say also we recognize that Christ suffered, and that gives us comfort. And we also recognize then, and we believe and teach, that because Christ's suffering saved us, when we suffer, it can help other people. And that's a very important thing. My suffering that I endure, whatever it is, my suffering can help other people. I can ask this suffering that I'm going through to help other people, other situations, other things that I'm going through. And so we have that Catholic phrase, offer it up. You guys have heard that, right? As if you're a Catholic, maybe if you're not a Catholic, you've not heard that, but we say that all the time as Catholics. When I'm going through suffering, what we say to each other, we remind each other, offer this suffering up for someone because it does something. It helps someone else. It helps bring them comfort. It helps bring about the salvation of the world. I wanted to, my brother sent out an email right before he went into surgery, and he's only 19, but I've really just been blown away by his faith in the midst of all of this. And he says that, he said to all of our siblings, he said, I'm going to offer up the intentions that you all have in the midst of my surgery and in my recovery. I want to take full advantage of the fight that I'm about to engage in. He said, God has a hard time not answering the prayers of His suffering sons and daughters. I want to offer up this surgery for a greater cause than myself, and what greater cause is there than your intentions? If I'm really struggling one day, it will be a tremendous boost of strength knowing that my suffering is at least benefiting all of you. So he asked us all for intentions that he could take with him into this stuff that he's going through right now, his recovery and all of the agony involved in that. So that to me was just like, wow, I don't know if I would have cranked that out as a 19-year-old, but it was, again, that very Catholic notion of suffering for other people, and that it helps bring about the goodness for other people, and then we can offer our suffering. And then, so I'm going to just close with this. I think, so we talk about suffering as Catholics, and I think it's a message that the world really desperately needs to hear, because so many people think of suffering as meaningless, as having no value, as just being something that is completely devoid of any purpose. And that is really the true agony of suffering. If you think of suffering as that, then that's like the ultimate depression. That's the ultimate sort of, just that you're already in agony, you're already suffering, and then you think that it's just happening for no reason, or God's doing it to you out of punishment. If you don't have the right understanding of suffering, then it just almost becomes this black hole of nothingness, that you're in meaninglessness that you're staring into. John Paul II, then I'll end with this. He said that suffering helps me join in solidarity with other people who are suffering, first of all. And we have to admit that the vast majority of the world is suffering. 25,000 children die every day of starvation. The vast majority of the world is poorer than our poorest person in the United States. On and on. When I suffer, when I fast on Ash Wednesday, I think more about the people that are hungry, because I'm hungry. When I'm with my brother in the hospital room, I think more about the other people that are watching their family members go through those kinds of things, or who are experiencing that. And so there's a solidarity. There's like this sense in which we become a family precisely through our suffering. And there's strength in numbers. We hear that all the time. And when I think that I'm going through this with other people, and I'm doing this in solidarity with other people, there's a real strength in that. And John Paul II, I think this is kind of then finally the encapsulation of the teaching. He says, mankind, a man or a woman, can do anything if they have a reason. There is joy, he said, in overcoming a sense of the uselessness of suffering. Once I recognize my suffering is not useless, there's a joy in that. And I recognize this is going to help someone. This is going to help bring about the salvation of the world, the salvation of other people, the conversion of other people, precisely for the same reason that Christ did that too. Again, there's a joy in overcoming that, John Paul II said, and I think that's the Catholic notion of suffering, that if we can overcome that, if we recognize what suffering really is, then it allows us to go into it with the proper attitude, and it will allow us to probably a lot more, it'll increase our chances, I think, of being able to come through on the other side with the proper attitude, and not some of the despair and some of the depression and all of those sorts of things that so many people naturally fall into, because they don't have the good news that suffering is doing anything. So I think it's a message that we have to get out more, and it's one of those reasons. I know it's kind of like, wow, that's really, I hope it's not, I don't want it to be a sad thing. Like I don't think of it as a sad thing. I think it's, as John Paul II said, it's a joyful thing to know that our suffering, whatever it is, that it's not meaningless, that it's not necessarily God just like hammering you with a hammer, or anything like that. That it's an opportunity to help other people, to grow closer to God through that time as well. So